Hey, everybody, welcome to the Fractured Faith and Mosaic of Belief podcast. It's your host, Joshua Hopping, and welcome to 2026. It's talk about a crazy time. Recording this on January 4th, 2026. I'll probably be releasing it the following day. Lots of it happening, a lot of things going over it. I know I took a break over the holidays, but I'm back with season 2 as we kind of expand the Fractured Faith podcast. I know last year we kind of started with a co-host with Angel, who kind of had to pause because of some stuff with her work and where she was. But we're going to continue to go, right? As we explore just the historical and the biblical context for a lot of the different church doctrines and theologies that we have, understanding and thinking through what that means, practically means to us in our daily lives, as well as kind of being aware of the different ways that people have looked at different doctrines and beliefs throughout history, knowing that the mystery, the faith is much, much mysterious than what we tend to kind of believe or kind of focus in, especially within American evangelicalism, tends to try to have a very narrow focus. And where my goal is really to kind of expand that a little bit. We kind of talk through and just rethink about some of the things. One of the things you all see me this last year in season 1 is I tend to talk a little bit about thinking about doctrine and theology from a Cherokee point of view, and that's because I'm a Cherokee Nation citizen. I'm actually living close to reservation in Arkansas right now, but that definitely is where a lot of my thought process is how do I contextualize and think through things in a way that actually is more true to my heritage and my standing as a Native American rather than my I guess my other standing as a European American, because I am kind of a half-blood a little bit on that. But those are the things we kind of ponder and we think about. And as we kind of come into season 2, I do want to thank you guys for listening and for your support and liking the podcast, whether you're listening on YouTube, on Spotify, or on Apple Podcasts. I really do appreciate that. The more that you're able to just interact with me, it's just, lets me know you're still there. Make sure you're sharing that and subscribing and following it, obviously, so you make sure you get it. My schedule started off really solid last year, and I know I kind of lost it a little bit in the fall. I want to try to get back into getting this out every 2 weeks. Hopefully, Lord willing, put it on Indian time. Can I blame Indian time? Things are a little bit hectic. But it's also some exciting things as we kind of talk through some stuff on the podcast. So, with all that said, though, I do want to kind of get into the topic at hand today. And we're really going to be talking about the Incarnation. We just got through Christmas time. And Christmas, of course, celebrates the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. We have a lot of nativity scenes, a lot of songs and things talking about Jesus, his birth. And, of course, we have, there's always the Santa Claus and all the presents part of that as well. But within our Christian tradition, it really is about Jesus. It's about the Incarnation, about how God comes down into human history, so to speak, as a child. That's the Incarnation. Incarnation, incarnate, the in flesh, carne being flesh, the in flesh dwelling of God. You think about John 1, beginning of John 1, it talks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he then came down and he became a true human being, and he pitched his tent, or he tabernacled among us, and it kind of showed us the way, which is just mind-blowing, this radical concept if you actually stop and think about it, that the creator God of everything in heaven and earth actually came down and became fully human to be able to walk with us is quite just strange. Now, what's even stranger of that one is the Incarnation was as a baby, because if you think about in the first century, there was lots of gods and goddesses that actually took on human appearance. Zeus, and Aphrodite and Hermes and Jupiter, and a lot of these kind of gods and goddesses would regularly assume these different human appearances and interact with the world around them. Zeus, of course, was famous to bedding and having a human sexual relationship with lots of human women, and he would have lots of half-blood children. Yeah, Hercules, for example. Well, dude, the entire Percy Jackson series is built upon these gods and goddesses, having a relationship with mere mortals and then having these children. So when you think about the God of the Hebrew Bible, he could have chose, if you wanted to be able to appear as a human, just like Zeus did or anybody else. But instead of actually doing that as a fully fledged, adult person or a child, God of the Hebrew Bible, the God that we now know, Jesus of Nazareth, came in as a baby, as a child that was helpless. It was just, needed community in order to actually survive. Needed mother, needed milk, and needed a family and people around him to be able to live. And that is just completely bonkers and mind bending in so many ways. That may be a podcast of a different time to really kind of maybe explore some of that other ones. I'll think about that one as we get into it. But today, really, with that framing, you tell I kind of go off topic sometimes, but with that framing, the title of this podcast is "The Incarnation Was Always the Plan." Okay, the incarnation was always the plan. And what I mean by that is because a lot of times in our Christmas story, when we're talking about Jesus coming down and he's born in Bethlehem in this manger, is really this idea that there was the creation, there was the fall of creation, and then we have a problem to fix, right? So Adam and Eve, they make a bad decision in the Garden of Eden. They disobey God, they kicked out, sin enters the world, aka the fall, and then that's the problem they fixed. And as that problem they fixed, Jesus then, or God sends Jesus, or he became Jesus as the divine son to incarnation to fix the problem. So in other words, the incarnation was never the plan. Incarnation was the solution to the problem that came in after. In other words, is plan B. And that's normally how I would say most churches have talked about Christmas, have talked about God coming into this world, the birth of Jesus, the incarnation. It is solving the problem that happened. And yet I want to question that logic. I'm going to question that presupposition, so to speak. And I want us to kind of stop and kind of think a little bit about maybe a different way of looking at it, maybe how we think about the incarnation as always being the plan, that the plan always was to become incarnate, right? Because under the other viewpoint, so if the incarnation was plan B, if it was that what happens after things go wrong, humanity kind of feels like a liability. Creation is temporal. Jesus' reaction was not intentional. Again, it's like, oh crap, my kids have messed up. Now I got to fix the problem. Even if you frame it in the sense of way that God knew that was going to happen and he knew there was a possibility, it's still like, oh, sigh, they did it. I knew they were going to do it and they did it anyway. Now I got to go down there. Now I got to be incarnate. Now I got to be able to do that to solve the problem, right? In other words, the incarnation always is this plan B reactionary thing built out of a problem rather than being the kind of the end desire, right? And so that's really what I think about is, well, what if Christmas wasn't God responding to a failure, but what if it's God moving towards fulfillment? Maybe another way of doing it is, what would have happened if Adam and Eve obeyed God? Okay, if the quote unquote the fall, which I see problems with that before you get other podcasts, you look at that. I don't really like that language, but What happens if they never sinned, if they didn't disobey, if we stayed in the garden, would the incarnation still have happened then? That's kind of the question we're asking. And I understand that there's a little bit of theoreticalness coming here, but I think it's worth asking because it helps us understand the relationship God had between himself and creation, between the incarnation, the coming of Jesus, the importance of Jesus, as well as ourselves. I mean, there's implications that goes with all of that, how we understand why Jesus came and what was his purpose when he came, right? So within that, I want to kind of back up. Let's go back and we can even think about Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve, of course, Adam, whether they were a true physical couple or not, that's debatable. Adam, or I would say Adam here, but Adam would have been more closer to the Jewish pronunciation, which is mankind, out of the dirt. It's more generic, again, like mankind. It's just Adam is humans. It's really all it means. It's just humans. Eve, which is kind of more, I believe it's the mother of all creation or something like that. But it's this idea that are they really the names themselves? They kind of lend to this deal question of where they really are. Were they more poetic in nature, or are they real couples? I don't know. I'm not going to speculate right now. I think there's the gospel stands with either way, quite frankly, but. However you think of Adam and Eve, they're not the world's first criminals. They're our kin. They're our family. They're our people, right? And we know that sin is in the world. If you look at the Old Testament and you look at what's going on there, I think it's very, very telling in the sense that the actions of Adam and Eve in the garden is not mentioned at all in the entire Old Testament. It's not. It is completely. It's not there, and it's just not. You have like one reference to Adam, in I think Chronicles where Adam's listed in a kind of a family tree of records and talk about the rest of the time. It's not there, and there's a sense that even in the Hebraic Judaism, there's this ideal that Adam and Eve is kind of a short story of what happens with the people of Israel. If you think of people of Israel, they're put into the promised land, they're given the Torah, they're given instructions, and they mess up just like Adam and Eve does. They mess up, and they then, they have a way back because they have the Torah where Adam and Eve doesn't have Torah. But you almost see this parallel between what's happening with them versus what's happening in the garden. Both of which actually, interesting enough, Adam and Eve was never supposed to stay in the garden. If you actually read the text, God says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and to go throughout the entire earth. In other words, don't just stay in the garden. You're to have kids and you spread, and humanity is supposed to go across the entire earth, just like Israel was supposed to come in the promised land and spread the message of the kingdom of God to all nations. And you're like, hey, this is my name. My name will be honored among the nations because of what I do here, right? And so there's definitely this message or this point of, hey, tell the world of what's going on in that areas, in those places. And so that kind of tells you the whole ideal of Adam and the fall of the sin, that really comes much, much later. It actually comes out of Paul, and there's a couple passages in Paul, and there are really two passages that Paul talks about that we've kind of set our whole theological doctrine on those two passages, which is insane to me if you think about that. But Paul is writing to a multi-ethnic, kind of religious congregation, and he's trying to draw everybody in and say, hey, pay attention to me. So he kind of sets up this ideal of the first couple and kind of setting the kind of the area of what's going on. But the whole point of this, what I'm getting to, is if we look at this ideal of Adam and Eve and even what's going in on there, the ideal isn't that there was rules violator. So there was actually a loss of trust or loss of harmony that was actually gone, right? That ideal of obedience, unmerited obedience to God, the King, was really not really there. The goal was communications to talk through, and God loved having to communication with the people, right? He would come down in the cool of the evenings and he would hang out and talk to them. And when they actually, not only when they disobeyed, but that they lied about disobeying, that's where wonder what would have happened if they would have just repented right then, right? God said, hey, you messed up. And like, yep, we did. We're sorry. We apologize. I'm sorry. Which is what the Mosaic kind of covenant basically tells them. The law tells them, hey, if you mess up, come make a sacrifice and restore their relationship, right? The Mosaic law was never to get into relationship. They were assumed that you already were in relationship. It was like, hey, what happens when you mess up? What do you do? How do you restore that relationship? And that really is what we're looking at. So this is when we look at sin. Sin is not a legal sense of sin. You're going to go to jail or something like that. Not a legal code. It really is to a relationship missing. The Hebrew word hata is sin, which is literally means miss the mark, right? It's missing something we're trying to. It's almost more of an archery term of what you're going, and we missed that mark. Or other words of alan or pesha, which again maybe I'm mispronouncing it, but pesha or rupture. It's a breach of trust. It's a relational fracture. It's a crookedness is coming in on this sense. And that's kind of what comes into it. And God, when that happened, when the relationship was fractured, God says, yeah, there's consequences to what's going on. And so when Adam and Eve leave the garden, God goes with them and he continues to interact with them. He doesn't stay in the garden. And I think this is a great fact. He puts the sword there to stop it, but you see God still talking with Cain, with Abel, with the different people, Noah, with all the people, even Melchizedek. All these people are being talked with and lived with, and God's interacting with, right? And so it's all in there because God always wanted that information in that places, and that's really where he wanted to go, was being able to say that this is that relationship I'm having with you, and that is key, which is why he's very much entwined with all of the patriarchs and Adam and Isaac and Joseph and even Methuselah. Well, I guess Methuselah was the one who lived long, but Melchizedek was the priest of Salem. So I get my names all right. But you even see here, Melchizedek was not even a Hebrew, because there was no Hebrew. It was just Adam or Abraham, sorry, just Abraham. And during that time, there was no Jewish people, and God's still interacting with other people groups outside of Abraham and his family, because God has always been interacting with his people, right? And that was always the key of what's happening. And yet so much at the time we hear the kind of framing of where, well, God just separate himself, and that people, basically he didn't want anything to do with humanity until Jesus comes along and fixes it. And I'm like, God is intimately involved in every area of human life, in the garden, outside the garden, all around it, right? And in that mindset, when you think about it, how humanity was always a goal. His goal was to connect people to him. So if the incarnation was a sense of being connected to humanity, right? And that if the fall never happened, then I think the incarnation would have happened, because the incarnation does more than just remove sin or fight sin. The incarnation was a way of deepening the relationship between humanity and God, right? The creator and the creation become even more connected together after the incarnation than it does before the incarnation. And this would have been true regardless of when the incarnation happened. I think the incarnation happened when it happened because of probably the failure of Adam and Eve and of the people, that they kind of probably delayed the inedible, but it was going to happen. God was going to do this regardless of what was going to happen. Is the timing of that and how that happened changed because I think of humans' interactions with history and with God. But the goal was to be able to have that interaction in that community. So the kind of if I kind of keep going down the line here, if I go to Paul, right? So we got good old Paul. Paul it talks about Paul Well, Paul talks about Christ not being impoverished. Christ the redemption of Christ is unfolding with a deeper, more older intent, right? So we go to Ephesians 1:4. Paul says he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in sight. So you see this verse that before all creation, God has chosen us to be with him. So again, this is the ideal that the beginning, the desire, the mission the first mission is to be able to have humans, us, holy and blameless in his sight. Now that would need to be happening whether or not they were in the garden or not, right? Because even with Adam and Eve being in the garden before they disobeyed, there was still a separation because they were still the created, he was still the creator, and there really was still need to be this deeper sin within them. But again, I don't think Adam and Eve really brought sin in because it was more the storyline. And again, this is my more of a mystic side coming in, but again, if you look at the Bible, Adam and Eve and the response thereof, it doesn't show up anywhere until Paul, and which means that everybody apparently missed the picture until like for thousands of years until Paul somehow got on there. Even Jesus doesn't talk about that, right? He just talks about the kingdom of God, the interactions of the rule and reign of God coming in. He doesn't talk about Adam and Eve beyond he just made a reference to their marriage, but he doesn't talk about anything about their decisions. So again, it's almost an assumption that sin actually is in the world, right? That things are there, consequences are happening. How do we maintain the relationships and how we go for it? So before the creation of the world, Paul has told us that, hey, God wants to have a relationship with us. Or if you go to Colossians 1, this is 15 through 20, he talks about the image, the Son is the image of invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. In him, all things were created, all things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, and so forth, right? And he goes towards the end of verse 19, because God please have all fullness dwell in him. Through him, we're able to reconcile all things to himself, whether earth and heaven, making peace, right? So there's this whole interactions within and through Jesus that came through it, which what would have happened, need to happen, regardless of whether or not what Adam or Eve did or did not do. There needed to be this fullness between nature and themselves. Romans 8, we talk about how creation groans, waiting the time to come into it, right? Now, I don't think this is just the results because, hey, we have one person that disagrees. I'm like, no. Again, the Old Testament really was this almost assumption that there was problems and sin was there. There was, how do we get this missing the mark? How do we get restored relationship? How do we get deeper into things? So Jesus was planning to come, and with the interactions of the incarnation wasn't just to get us, our souls to heaven. The incarnation, or what happened at Christmas when God entered into his world, was that all of cosmic creation, all of nature was affected. All of our relationship was figured. All of us was figured out. Everything was pulled into. This wasn't just hey, I want to get these people out, because quite honestly, God could have done that in any way he wanted to. He could have just say, hey, I want you all to come with me, right? He didn't just want to, escape hell, if there is a hell. To go back and listen to those podcasts. But the incarnation was to really bring and lock things together. It was the fact that we have a high priest that knows what it's like in every ways to be able to live after him. It is that creation itself has now been reamed holy because God himself has entered into creation, and all the microbes that were in his gut and his belly that were living together, the non-human parts of his body that was made up into it, that was part of creation that was living within him. The water, the air, the places, all this was being brought back into the things. And that's what this incarnation does. It really does bring everything in and merges creation and creator together in a way that can only be done as if through the incarnation. There was never this, it just, again, can y'all get the mystery of this? Can you get the tension of this? We almost do Christmas injustice because we don't stop and really think how radically insane it is that we're talking about this God coming into our world and becoming a baby and growing and alive. It's just, it almost is too much for us to like blow our brains in some ways, but that's what's happening. And that's how much he loved us. And it's not just to rescue us up to from creation to be able to go to heaven. It's he's uniting creation with himself in all aspects, all of the rocks, the trees, the animals, the breath, the airs, the microbes, the insects, were all being united and brought into union with God. Not in like a nirvana, like disappearing into each other. No, we stay independent, but we're also more us than we ever been, because the more fuller us because of what he's done, right? It is a sense that Christ isn't just merely a plan B, just a, hey, oh crap, my people messed up, I got from. It really is this thing of my desire from the beginning of creation always have been to be in communication with my people and my family, and this is what I'm going to pull back, right? Christ is a center around all creations that goes around, centers around creation. The incarnation really is the keystone of all that is there. It is everything that is. And it is so much of what's happening is the fact that he was there. And that's amazing. It's insane, insanely crazy and amazing. Now, what Paul was hinting at here in the creation hills, now a lot of the early church and some of the folks before has really kind of started saying this out loud, moving like I am, like, hey, the incarnation was always the plan. The plan was always to bring us all together. Now I have some quotes I want to be able to read to you, some places to come into it. And Athanasius is Alexandria is a great one. Third or fourth century, so 296, about 371 AD in Egypt, Greek-speaking Egyptian Christianity. Again, this is under the Roman Empire, outside of the Latin part of the empire, right, and more of the Hellenistic kind of north one. And he actually, in his great book on the incarnation, he actually talks about how Jesus, the incarnation, came that we might be made God. The incarnation, he was incarnate that we may become gods. And this idea of becoming God isn't a sense that we're going to become, our own powerful beings up there zapping people around, wherever else. Like, no, but he's talking about is that we can participate in the divine life. This is that we are becoming more and more Christ-like. We are being transformed into the image of Jesus day in and day out, right? So everything we're coming in there, all the healing, all the becoming, we're bringing that into it so that we might become like he is like. The incarnation happened. He became like us so we could become like him, is another way of putting that, right? He doesn't rescue us from being human. Being human is a good thing, right? But God enters humanity in order to make humanity and restore humanity, to bring humanity up into deeper relationship with him. And that really, really becomes the incarnation, becomes the beauty of what happens. Later on, we have Maximus Confessor. This is 580 to 662 AD. This is the Byzantine Eastern Empire in Constantinople. And he talks about, hey, this is the incarnation is the blessed end for which all things were made. The creation itself was oriented towards union with God. And the incarnation was the sense that when the creator came down and brought into it, and all eternity comes into that one. And that's a fulfillment was coming in, right? So this, as he says, quote, this blessed end for which all things were made. Or we go into Honorius Autumn. This is about 1100s up in Germany right now. And he talks about man's first sin was not the cause of Christ's incarnation. The cause was the predestination of human deification. Okay. Again, I understand those words might jump out as a little bit different, a little bit crazier, but this is our ancestors talking. This is coming in Germany, France, coming in. He's like, hey, and this is really where it comes out really key here in the 1100s. But he's like, the man's first sin was not the cause of incarnation, which is what I've been trying to say here today. The cause was the predestination of human deification. In other words, again, we are being transformed into the image of Jesus. And that is what's happening. That's what he knew before the beginning of time, before all creation made. He always knew that this is where he was taking us, that the incarnation is going to bring unity with our Heavenly Father, with Jesus, and it's going to bring us to a deeper relationship going. This is why the garden, if you look at the garden in Revelations 21, I believe 21, 22, right in the end, at the very end, is, it ends with the garden with Jesus coming down with it. It's amazing because all of heaven comes down and lives on earth. Right? Humans, the end point of humans is not to go live with God in some celestial heaven on a cloud with a harp coming on there. The end goal is that God will come down here on this earth, and this earth is going to be transformed into a new heaven, new earth, that creation itself will be brought into better unity and union with the Creator, that we ourselves will be into. That is the end goal. That was always the goal from the very beginning. This is why the incarnation would have happened even if Adam and Eve didn't sin, even if they didn't do anything else. The goal always was to bring heaven down here, to bring creation into union with God, right? So this is just going on. Because we mess up and kind of delay things a little bit doesn't mean anything, but we still have that goal from the beginning of creation. God always desired that union with us. John Duns Scotus, this is the 1300s, right? So it's like 1266 to 1308, late 1200s and early 1300s, up in Scotland. Okay, this is our Scottish kind of brothers up there. And he's saying, hey, even if one man did not sin, Christ still would have been predestined, right? He's coming in. Sin is not the center of the story. The center of the story is Jesus. Jesus in the incarnation is the center. God's love is the center. Throughout the entire Old Testament, we see God's love interacting with, working with, bringing union and peace and love down with the people, because he so cared about his people. He actually covenanted himself to it. He made treaties and covenants with his people so that they can be able to walk with him. He bound himself to Abraham, to Isaac, to Joseph, to the Israelites, to the people. He bound himself to creation in ways that just it blows your mind when you think about what that is. And that was always the goal. But Paul said from the very beginning, before the creation was even made, he knew and predestined us to be with him. So Christmas is not a reaction to sin. Christmas was going to happen regardless of sin. Christmas was always going to happen. Now, how it happened, when it happened, and where it happened, I think that was slightly up for debate, depending on the actions of humanity, but it always was going to happen. The incarnation was the goal, always was the goal, and always will be the goal, because of what it does to ourselves, to creation, and everything, right? So I want to say that this theology does not minimize the cross. Again, it deepens that cross. The cross was, and I know Paul and people use the word cross as kind of this catchphrase deal. And it was a crazy, crazy event, right? But the cross is only important because of the incarnation. If it was just another human on that cross, and it wasn't God, then that cross would just be another human dying. And there are people who die all the time. In Jesus' lifetime, there was, before, I think he was like, 5 or 6, and they had like 2,000 people killed and crucified in the hills around Nazareth before rebelling against the Roman Empire. There was multiple Jewish messiahs before and after Jesus. Okay? The cross was the cross. The cross is only important, though, because of the incarnation. Christmas comes before Easter. Christmas comes before Easter, before Good Friday, before anything happens. You have to have the incarnation, which is why I love John, because the Word was, at the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he came down, and the Word became human, and it dwelt among us. We have to keep that in the forefront of our minds and our hearts, to realizing that that is where we're going. that the incarnation is that divine nearness, is this ideal of how my love he wants to be and bring us to it. It's not something, it's not plan B. This wasn't like, oh, God was caught off surprise and he's like, oh crap, I gotta do something to fix it. The incarnation was always the plan because God, like, go back to Athanasius and these guys, hey, God became human so that we may become like him in so many ways. So this is something to chew on, something to think about. I know it can be mind bending. I know it's sometimes a little bit quite twisty or whatnot. And I know it defies sometimes the simple lines that we want to say. But you know what? The faith is much mysterious than we give it credit for. It's much more mysterious and mystic than we give it, right? So we must realize, and I think take time to think about the incarnation, to think really about what Christmas is, to think about how it differs from other religions and other groups that tends to think about it. Because there were other religions that had, people, gods dying and coming back together. The Egypt they had, the other people had it. But the incarnations as a baby is unique. The fact that God became human and was born in a manger is something very unique. And this here, the word becoming flesh, was not a reaction. It was not a backup plan. It was a fulfillment of a that's older than time. It is something that happened and will continue to happen from the beginning of beginning. It happened. Excuse me, I had a little cough there, but think about that as you look at Christmas, as you look at it, that God is just for us in so many ways. Thank you guys again. I appreciate you guys listening to me here on Fractured Faith Podcast. Keep it up. Drop a comment down. If you have other topics and stuff you want to talk about, let me know. Until next time, we will always end with Dona Daga Ai, which is until next time, because we do not have the word goodbye in the Cherokee language. Take care.